In the grand halls of the Langford estate, where marble floors reflect old money and older secrets, a young maid named Belle James tends to more than just household duties. When 7-year-old Henry Langford declares she should be his new mother, it sets in motion a chain of events that will challenge everything his billionaire father Charles believes about love, family, and social boundaries. What begins as an innocent child's wish becomes a battle against tradition, power, and a formidable matriarch determined to preserve the family's pristine reputation at any cost. This is a story of love that transcends social class, a family formed by choice rather than blood, and the courage to fight for what truly matters. Before we start this story, comment below from where you are watching us. The early morning sunlight streamed through the massive windows of the Langford estate, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Belle James wiped her brow as she polished the last of the silver in the dining room. At 27, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her position as the live-in maid for one of the country's wealthiest families. "Miss Belle," a small voice echoed down the hallway. Brielle's face softened instantly. "In here, Henry." 7-year-old Henry Langford appeared in the doorway, his school uniform slightly rumpled and his shoelaces untied. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "You promised to help with my science project today," he said, bouncing on his heels. "And I will after you finish breakfast." She set down her polishing cloth and knelt to tie his shoes. "Did you brush your teeth?" Henry nodded eagerly. "And I packed my own lunch." "Let me see," Belle said, following him to the kitchen where his lunchbox sat open on the counter. Inside was a jumble of cookies and candy bars. Belle laughed. "Nice try. How about we add a sandwich and some apple slices to that sugar feast?" As she prepared a proper lunch, the kitchen door swung open. Charles Langford strode in, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his face set in the stern expression he'd worn since his wife's death 4 years ago. At 39, he was still handsome, with dark hair just beginning to grey at the temples, but there was a coldness to him that made most of the staff keep their distance. "Henry, the car is waiting," he said, without looking up from his phone. "But I haven't had breakfast yet," Henry said, his voice suddenly small. Charles glanced at his watch. "You're running late." "I'll fix him something quick," Belle offered. "It'll just take a minute." Charles finally looked up, noticing her for the first time. For a moment something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of her place in his son's life. Then he nodded curtly. "5 minutes," he said, and walked out. Henry's shoulders slumped as his father left. Belle quickly made him a piece of toast with jam and poured a glass of milk. "He's just busy with work," she said gently, though she'd been saying the same thing for years. "Eat up now. I'll see you after school for that project." After Henry left, Belle continued with her daily routine, dusting the library, changing linens, preparing a light lunch that Charles would probably skip. She'd been working at the Langford estate for 3 years, originally hired as one of many household staff members. But when Henry's last nanny quit after just 1 week, Belle had stepped in to help with the boy. What had started as temporary assistance had evolved into something more. Now she was not just the maid, but Henry's caretaker, the one who knew which stories he liked at bedtime, how he preferred his sandwiches cut, and what scared him during thunderstorms. That evening, as Belle helped Henry with his model of the solar system, Charles watched from the doorway of the study, unnoticed by either of them. "Neptune is my favorite," Henry was saying as he painted a small ball blue. "Why's that?" Belle asked, steadying the base of the model. "Because it's so far away from everything else, but it's still important." Henry looked up at her. "Do you think Mom can see Neptune from heaven?" Brielle's hand paused. These questions about his mother always broke her heart. "I bet she can see all the planets, and I bet she's watching you right now, so proud of her smart boy." Henry smiled, a rare sight that transformed his usually solemn face. He reached over and hugged Belle tightly. From the doorway, Charles cleared his throat. Henry jumped back, and Belle quickly stood up. "It's past your bedtime, Henry," Charles said. "We're almost finished, Mr. Langford," Belle replied, "just putting the final touches on his project." "I'll take him up," Charles said, surprising them both. He so rarely involved himself in Henry's bedtime routine. Belle nodded. "Good night, Henry. Sleep tight." As Charles led his son upstairs, Belle cleaned up the art supplies, wondering if she'd crossed a line. The moments when she comforted Henry about his mother always made her uneasy. It wasn't her place, yet who else would do it? Later that night, after finishing the last of her chores, Belle heard a cry from upstairs. She rushed up to find Henry thrashing in his bed, caught in the grip of one of his night terrors. "No, no, don't go," he sobbed in his sleep. "Shh, I'm here, Brielle said, sitting on the edge of his bed and gently stroking his hair. You're safe, Henry. It's just a dream. Gradually, his breathing slowed. She hummed softly an old lullaby her own mother used to sing. When he finally settled back into peaceful sleep, she turned to find Charles standing in the doorway again, his face unreadable in the dim light. This happens often? He asked quietly. A few times a week, Brielle admitted. Usually after he's been thinking about his mother. Charles's jaw tightened. I wasn't aware. He doesn't want to worry you. Brielle stood, suddenly conscious of how intimate the scene must look, her in her simple nightgown, comforting his son in the middle of the night. You should have told me, Charles said, a hint of accusation in his voice. I'm sorry, Mr. Langford. I thought it best to handle it quietly. She moved past him into the hallway. Good night, sir. As she walked back to her small room in the staff wing, Brielle felt Charles's eyes following her. Their interactions were always like this, brief, formal, laden with unspoken tensions. He was her employer, nothing more. The fact that she was raising his son while he buried himself in work was just an uncomfortable truth they both ignored. The next morning, Charles was gone before breakfast as usual, but there was a commotion in the kitchen when Brielle came down. Mrs. Reynolds, the cook, was muttering to herself as she aggressively chopped vegetables. What's wrong? Brielle asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She's coming, Mrs. Reynolds said darkly. The queen bee herself. Brielle didn't need to ask who she was. Mrs. Eleanor Langford, Charles's mother, visited the estate rarely, but her visits always left everyone on edge. When? Today. Her driver called ahead. She'll be here for lunch. Mrs. Reynolds pointed her knife at Brielle. And she's bringing guests. By noon, the estate was polished to perfection. Brielle had changed from her usual work clothes into the more formal uniform she wore when the family entertained, a simple black dress with a white collar. Eleanor Langford arrived with the subtlety of a hurricane, sweeping through the front doors in a cloud of expensive perfume. At 65, she remained a formidable woman, her silver hair styled impeccably, her posture rigid with old money pride. Charles isn't here to greet me, were her first words. He's been delayed at the office, Mrs. Langford, Brielle said. He asked that you make yourself comfortable. He'll join you for lunch. Eleanor's gaze swept over Brielle with barely disguised distaste. You're still here, I see. Yes, ma'am. Where is my grandson? In the garden. Would you like me to get him? No need, I know my way around my family's home. Eleanor brushed past her, then paused. Oh, and we'll need 3 more place settings for lunch. I've brought some friends who are eager to meet Charles. When Charles finally arrived, he found his mother in the garden with Henry, and 3 elegantly dressed women in their 30s, all laughing at something his son had said. There he is, Eleanor exclaimed. Charles, darling, come meet my friends. This is Patricia Whitmore. Her father sits on the board of First National, and this is Jessica Harrington. She runs that wonderful charity for the arts. And Melissa Cartwright, I'm sure you remember her from the Prescott wedding last year. Charles greeted each woman with polite detachment. Brielle, who was setting up the outdoor lunch table nearby, couldn't help noticing how his mother had essentially arranged a lineup of potential wives for him to inspect. During lunch, Brielle moved silently around the table, refilling water glasses and serving food. Henry kept looking at her, clearly uncomfortable with the strange women who were paying him excessive attention. Henry tells me you've been handling his schooling, Eleanor said to Charles, though her eyes flicked briefly to Brielle. He has tutors, Charles replied, the best in the country. But no proper nanny, Eleanor pressed. A boy needs stability, Charles, a proper household. We manage, Charles said stiffly. Eleanor set down her fork with a decisive click. I've been patient. It's been 4 years since Julia passed, but this situation cannot continue. Charles's face hardened. Mother, this isn't the time. It's precisely the time, Eleanor insisted. I've spoken with the family lawyers. Your father's will contained certain provisions about the Langford heir being raised in a traditional family environment. The table fell silent. Even the 3 women looked uncomfortable. Are you threatening me? Charles asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm reminding you of your responsibilities, Eleanor replied. To this family, to your son. She smiled tightly at the 3 women. Which is why I've organized a little gathering this weekend. Just a few suitable young ladies who would make excellent additions to the Langford family. Charles stood abruptly. Henry, go inside with Brielle. The boy didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran to Brielle, who took his hand and led him into the house. In the kitchen, Henry was unusually quiet as Brielle fixed him a snack. Why does Grandma want Dad to marry one of those ladies? he finally asked. Brielle chose her words carefully. Your grandmother thinks your dad might be happier if he wasn't alone. He's not alone, Henry said. He has me, and he has you. Brielle's heart squeezed painfully. That's different, Henry. Why? Before she could answer, Charles stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed with anger. He stopped short when he saw them. Henry, go to your room for a while, he said. Once Henry was gone, Charles turned to Brielle. I apologize for my mother's behavior. No need, sir, it's not your fault. Charles ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration that made him seem suddenly human. She's insisting on this courtship weekend. 5 women, here at the estate. Brielle nodded, keeping her expression neutral, though her stomach sank at the thought. When? Next weekend. He looked at her directly, something he rarely did. I'll need your help. To make it go smoothly. For Henry's sake. Of course, Mr. Langford. For a moment he seemed about to say something more. Then he nodded once and left the kitchen. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Brielle sat at her small desk writing in her journal. She'd been keeping it since she started working for the Langfords, partly as a way to process the strange dynamics of the household. I don't belong here, she wrote. I never have, but Henry needs me. And sometimes when Charles looks at me like he did today, I wonder if he needs me too. Not that it matters. Women like me don't end up with men like him. That's not how the world works. She closed the journal and looked out her window at the moonlight, reflecting off the ocean beyond the estate grounds. Next weekend would bring change one way or another. Charles would choose one of those polished, wealthy women, and eventually Brielle would no longer be needed. The thought left her with an emptiness she wasn't ready to examine. Across the estate, Charles stood at his own window, looking out at the same ocean. On his desk lay the custody papers his mother had threatened him with. The terms were clear. If he didn't create a suitable family environment for Henry within 6 months, Eleanor would petition for shared custody. The thought of losing any control over his son's upbringing was unbearable. And yet the idea of marrying one of his mother's hand-picked candidates felt equally wrong. He thought of Brielle, how naturally Henry went to her, how she seemed to know instinctively what his son needed, something his own flesh and blood, and he still couldn't figure out. For the first time in years, Charles allowed himself to really see the woman who had been living under his roof, not as the maid, not as Henry's caretaker, but as Brielle James. A woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who had somehow become the center of his son's world while he wasn't looking. And maybe, just maybe, she could become something more to him as well. But that was a dangerous thought, one he pushed away as quickly as it had come. The week leading up to the courtship weekend passed in a blur of preparations. Brielle worked from sunrise to well past sunset, making sure every inch of the already immaculate estate was perfect. Fresh flowers appeared in every room. The guest bedrooms were prepared with expensive linens. Menus were planned for elaborate meals. Through it all, Henry watched with growing unease. I don't want these ladies to come, he confided to Brielle as she helped him pick out clothes for the weekend. Dad doesn't even like them. Your father just wants what's best for you, Brielle said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. But what if he marries one of them? Henry's voice trembled. What if she doesn't like me? What if she makes you leave? Brielle knelt down to his level, her heart breaking at the fear in his eyes. No one could ever make me leave you, Henry. I promise. But as she said it, she wondered if it was a promise she could keep. Friday afternoon arrived, and with it came the guests. The 5 women Eleanor had selected were everything Brielle wasn't: wealthy, white, connected to the right families. They arrived in expensive cars, wearing designer clothes, their hair and makeup flawless. Brielle greeted them at the door in her formal uniform, taking their bags and showing them to their rooms. Each one barely glanced at her, treating her exactly as what she was, the help. Charles appeared just before dinner, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was a touch more formal than his usual business attire. Eleanor had arrived early to orchestrate the weekend, and she beamed with satisfaction as she watched the women fawn over her son. Ladies, this is my son, Charles, she announced unnecessarily, and this is my grandson, Henry. Henry stood stiffly at his father's side, his face a mask of politeness that didn't reach his eyes. When one of the women, Victoria, a blonde socialite with a too bright smile, reached out to ruffle his hair, he flinched almost imperceptibly. Dinner was an elaborate affair. Brielle moved quietly around the table, serving food and pouring wine. She kept her eyes down, trying to be invisible, but she couldn't help noticing how Henry picked at his food, or how Charles barely smiled at the jokes and stories being told around him. "Charles, you simply must tell everyone about your new development project," Eleanor prompted. "Catherine's father is in real estate, you know." Catherine, a willowy brunette with perfect posture, leaned forward eagerly. "Daddy says your Ocean Point property is going to revolutionize luxury living in this area." "It's just a residential development," Charles said flatly. "Don't be modest," Eleanor insisted. "It's the most exclusive address on the eastern seaboard. Each home starts at 12 million. The conversation continued in this vein, talk of money, connections, and status. Through it all, Henry grew increasingly withdrawn. Twice Brielle saw him looking at her with silent desperation. When dessert was served, Henry pushed his plate away and turned to his father. "Dad, can Brielle read me a story before bed?" An awkward silence fell over the table. Eleanor's smile tightened. "I'd be happy to read you a story, Henry," offered Victoria, clearly trying to score points. "I used to be a kindergarten teacher before I started my charity foundation." "No, thank you," Henry said with the brutal honesty only a child could deliver. "Brielle does the voices better." Charles looked torn, caught between his son's wishes and the social expectations of the moment. "Perhaps one of our guests could read to you tonight, Henry, as a special treat." Henry's face fell. He looked at Brielle, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "Fine," he muttered, slumping in his chair. Later, as Brielle cleared the dessert plates, she overheard Eleanor speaking to Charles in the hallway. "You need to get that boy under control," Eleanor hissed. "His attachment to the maid is unhealthy." "He's 7 years old, Mother," Charles replied, "and Brielle has been good to him." "That's precisely the problem," Eleanor said. "You've allowed the help to overstep. When you choose one of these women, and you will choose one, Charles, the first order of business will be establishing proper boundaries." Brielle slipped away before she could hear Charles's response. In the kitchen, she worked mechanically, loading the dishwasher and wiping down counters. Mrs. Reynolds watched her with sympathetic eyes. "Don't let the old dragon get to you," the cook said. "She's been this way since Mr. Langford was a boy." "It's not my place to have feelings about it either way," Brielle replied, though her hands shook slightly as she dried a wine glass. "Humph. You've been more of a mother to that child than anyone since his poor mama died," Mrs. Reynolds said. "Everyone in this house knows it, even Mr. Langford, though he'd never admit it." Upstairs, Victoria had volunteered to read Henry his bedtime story. She sat perched on the edge of his bed, reading in a high, theatrical voice that made the boy cringe. Charles stood in the doorway, watching the uncomfortable scene. When Victoria finished the story, she leaned over to kiss Henry's forehead. He turned his face away. "Thank you for the story," he said politely. The manners Brielle had taught him kicking in despite his discomfort. After Victoria left, Charles sat on the edge of Henry's bed. "She was trying to be nice, Henry." "She's not, Brielle," Henry said simply, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. Charles sighed. "Henry, you know Brielle works for us. She's not family." Henry looked at his father with eyes too serious for a 7-year-old. "She feels like family to me." Before Charles could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Brielle stood there with a glass of water and Henry's medicine for his allergies. "I thought you might need these," she said, not meeting Charles's eyes. "Thank you, Brielle," Henry said, his whole face lighting up at the sight of her. As she handed him the pills and water, her fingers brushed against his small hand, and the tenderness in the gesture wasn't lost on Charles. It struck him suddenly that he couldn't remember the last time he'd touched his son with such natural affection. "Good night, Henry," Brielle said, turning to leave. "Wait," Henry called. "Can you sing the song? Please." Brielle hesitated, glancing at Charles. To her surprise, he nodded. So she sat on the edge of the bed and sang softly, a simple lullaby about stars and dreams. Henry's eyes grew heavy, and by the end of the song, he was asleep. In the hallway, Charles stopped her. "You do that every night?" "Most nights," Brielle admitted. "It helps with the nightmares." I didn't know he still had those. "Less often now. But yes." Charles ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Brielle had come to recognize as a sign of his inner turmoil. "You're good with him." "Better than I am." "That's not true, Mr. Langford. You're his father. He adores you." "He tolerates me," Charles corrected. "He adores you." There was no accusation in his voice, just a sad acknowledgement of fact. Brielle didn't know how to respond to that. After an awkward moment, she murmured, "Good night, sir," and retreated to her room. The next day brought more orchestrated activities. Eleanor had planned a picnic on the beach, followed by a yacht tour of the coastline. Henry was included in everything, with each woman trying to bond with him in increasingly desperate ways. Belle watched from a distance as she prepared the picnic baskets. Amanda, a redhead with a law degree and family connections to 3 senators, was showing Henry how to fly a kite. Victoria was setting up a portable easel, apparently planning to give him an art lesson. Catherine was discussing the private school she thought he should attend, while the other 2 women, Elizabeth and Diane, debated the merits of various summer camps for boys of Henry's caliber. Through it all, Henry looked miserable. Twice he tried to wander over to where Belle was setting up the picnic, and twice Eleanor intercepted him, steering him back to the potential stepmothers. Charles noticed his son's discomfort, but seemed at a loss for how to fix it. He made polite conversation with each woman, answered questions about his business, and occasionally glanced at Belle when he thought no one was looking. During a moment when the women were distracted by Eleanor's story about her recent trip to Paris, Charles quietly approached Belle. "He's not enjoying this," he said, nodding toward Henry. "It's a lot of attention from strangers," Belle replied, arranging sandwiches on a platter. "He's a shy boy." "Was he always this shy? Even with you?" Belle smiled at the memory. "No. When I first started, he hid behind the curtains and jumped out to scare me. Took me weeks to convince him I wasn't going to quit like the others." "Why didn't you?" Charles asked suddenly. "Quit, I mean. 6 nannies left before you stepped in. What made you stay?" Belle looked at Henry, who was now enduring Victoria's attempt to paint his portrait. He needed someone who saw him, not the Langford heir, just Henry. Something shifted in Charles's expression. For a moment, the cold, businesslike mask fell away, and Belle glimpsed the man underneath, vulnerable, uncertain, carrying a grief he'd never properly addressed. "Mr. Langford, come see Henry's portrait," Victoria called, breaking the moment. Charles turned away, but not before Belle saw a flash of something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or longing. The day wore on, each activity more forced than the last. By evening, even Eleanor had to admit that her carefully planned schedule wasn't producing the desired results. Henry was withdrawn, Charles was distant, and the women were running out of ways to impress them both. Dinner that night was a more subdued affair. The initial excitement had worn off, replaced by a competitive tension as each woman realized that being chosen as the next Mrs. Langford might be more challenging than they'd anticipated. "Charles, I was thinking," Amanda said, cutting into her steak. "Henry mentioned he's interested in marine biology. My brother runs the Oceanographic Institute downtown. I could arrange a private tour." "That's very thoughtful," Charles replied, though his tone suggested he was simply going through the motions. "I'd be happy to take him," Amanda continued. "It could be our special thing, just the 2 of us." Henry looked up from his plate, alarm flashing across his face. "Dad?" "We'll discuss it later, Henry," Charles said, clearly trying to avoid a scene. But Henry persisted. "Can Belle come too?" The table fell silent. Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. "Henry, that's not appropriate," she said sharply. "Belle has duties here at the house." "But she always takes me to my special places," Henry insisted. "She knows what I like." "Henry, enough," Charles said, his voice firmer than he'd intended. Henry's eyes filled with tears. Without another word, he pushed back his chair and ran from the room. "I'm so sorry," Charles said to the startled guests. "He's not usually like this." "Children can be sensitive to change," Catherine offered, with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "When my sister remarried, her son acted out for months." "He's not acting out," Charles said defensively. "He's just confused." "I'll check on him," Belle said quietly, already moving toward the door. "No," Eleanor commanded. "Let Charles handle this. It's time he took a more active role in disciplining the boy." Charles stood, torn between his mother's expectations and his instinct to let Belle handle the situation, as she always did. After a moment's hesitation, he followed Henry out of the room. He found his son in the library, curled up in the window seat where Belle often read to him. Henry's small shoulders shook with silent sobs. "Henry," Charles said, sitting beside him. "What's going on?" "I don't want a new mom," Henry said, his voice muffled. "Not one of them." "They're nice ladies," Charles said, though even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. "They want to make a home for you." "We already have a home," Henry insisted. "With Belle," Charles sighed. "Belle works for us, Henry. She's not part of our family." "Why not?" Henry looked up, his face streaked with tears. "She takes care of me. She makes me feel better when I'm sad. She knows how I like my sandwiches cut and which socks don't itch my feet. Isn't that what mums do?" The question hit Charles like a physical blow, because Henry was right. Brielle did all the things a mother would do, all the things he should have been doing as a father, but had been too lost in his own grief to manage. "It's complicated, Henry," was all he could say. "It's not complicated," Henry insisted with a child's clarity. "You're just scared." "Scared of what?" "Of being happy again," Henry said. "That's what Brielle told me when I was scared to go back to school after Mum died. She said it's okay to be happy again, and it doesn't mean we forget the people we lost." Charles stared at his son, stunned by the wisdom in his words, wisdom that had clearly come from Brielle. All this time, she'd been helping Henry process his grief in ways Charles had never thought to do. "Dad," Henry said, his voice small but determined. "I want Brielle to be my new mum, not those ladies." Before Charles could respond, a soft gasp came from the doorway. Brielle stood there, a tray with hot chocolate in her hands, her eyes wide with shock. She'd clearly heard Henry's declaration. I brought something to help Henry feel better," she stammered. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," Charles said, his voice strange even to his own ears. For the first time in years, he was seeing Brielle, really seeing her, not as the maid or his son's caretaker, but as a woman who had been quietly healing his broken family while he wasn't looking. Brielle set down the tray and backed toward the door. "I should go." "Stay," Charles said, surprising himself as much as her. "Please." She hesitated, then sat in the armchair across from them, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Henry looked between them, a flicker of hope crossing his tear-stained face. "Can she stay, Dad? Forever?" Charles didn't know how to answer that. The question was loaded with implications neither he nor Brielle was prepared to address. But looking at his son's hopeful face, he couldn't bring himself to crush that fragile optimism. "We'll talk about it," he said finally. "But first, let's get through this weekend." Henry nodded, seemingly satisfied with that non-answer for now. He reached for the hot chocolate, the crisis temporarily averted. Later that night, after Henry was asleep and the guests had retired to their rooms, Charles found Brielle on the back terrace, looking out at the moonlit ocean. She started when she heard his footsteps. "Mr. Langford," she said, moving to leave. "I was just getting some air." "Charles," he said, "when we're alone, I think you could call me Charles." Surprise flickered across her face. "That wouldn't be appropriate." "Nothing about this situation is appropriate," he said with a short laugh. "My mother is essentially auditioning women to be my wife and Henry's mother, while the person who's actually been mothering him for years serves them dinner." Brielle didn't know how to respond to that. She looked down at her hands. "I want to thank you," Charles continued, "for everything you've done for Henry. I haven't been the father he deserves since Julia died." "You've been grieving," Brielle said softly. "Grief doesn't follow a schedule." "No, but 4 years is long enough to have pulled myself together for my son's sake." Charles moved to stand beside her at the railing. "How did you know what he needed? All those things you do for him, the songs, the stories, knowing how to calm his fears. How did you learn that?" Brielle was quiet for a moment. "My mother died when I was 6, she finally said. "Not much younger than Henry was when he lost Julia. I remember what helped me and what didn't." "I'm sorry," Charles said, and he meant it. "I never knew." "You never asked," Brielle replied, then quickly added, "I'm sorry. That was out of line." "No, you're right." Charles turned to face her fully. "I've never asked about your life, your dreams, what you want beyond this job." Brielle felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "It doesn't matter. I'm happy here with Henry." "And what about when he grows up? Goes to college? What then?" The question caught her off guard. She'd never allowed herself to think that far ahead. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been taking online classes in childhood development. Maybe I'll be a teacher someday." Charles nodded, seeing yet another side of her he'd never bothered to notice before. "You'd be good at that." They stood in silence for a moment, the night air heavy with unspoken thoughts. "About what Henry said earlier," Brielle finally ventured. "About wanting me to—" "You should know I've never encouraged that kind of thinking. I've always been clear about my role." "I know," Charles said. "You've been nothing but professional, which makes it all the more remarkable that Henry loves you as much as he does." He paused, then added quietly, "You've given him something I couldn't." "That's not true," Brielle insisted. "He needs his father. He talks about you all the time, shows me your pictures in the business magazines. He's so proud of you." Charles looked genuinely surprised. "He is? Of course, you're his hero." Brielle smiled. "He told me once that when he grows up, he wants to be just like you, except he'll remember to laugh more." Charles felt something crack inside him, the icy shell he'd built around his heart since Julia's death. "Out of the mouths of babes," he murmured. From the shadows of the terrace doors, Eleanor watched the interaction with narrowed eyes. The way her son was looking at the maid confirmed her worst fears. This was precisely why she'd organized this weekend, to prevent Charles from making a catastrophic mistake that would tarnish the Langford name forever. She retreated silently, already formulating a new plan. If this weekend didn't produce the desired outcome, she would have to take more drastic measures to ensure the Langford legacy remained intact. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear. Eleanor had planned a farewell brunch on the terrace, a final opportunity for Charles to evaluate his options before the women departed. The table was set with fine china, mimosas were poured, and a spread of gourmet breakfast foods awaited the guests. Charles appeared in a casual suit, looking more relaxed than he had all weekend. Henry followed, wearing a little blue blazer that matched his father's suit, a detail Belle had arranged, knowing it would make the boy feel grown up and important. The 5 women arrived one by one, each making a strategic entrance designed to leave a lasting impression, but Charles greeted them all with the same polite detachment he'd shown throughout the weekend. Eleanor, sensing her plan was faltering, made one last attempt to salvage it. "Charles, darling, I thought perhaps before everyone leaves, you might share your thoughts about this lovely weekend. Perhaps there's someone who's made a special impression." The women perked up, each hoping to be singled out. Henry looked anxiously at his father. Charles cleared his throat. "Actually, I had something different in mind." He turned to his son. "Henry, we talked about this weekend being a chance for you to help me choose someone who might become a part of our family, someone who would care for you, support you, be there for you when you need them." Henry nodded solemnly. "So," Charles continued, "I'd like to know your thoughts. If you had to choose one person from this weekend who you'd want in our lives permanently, who would it be?" Eleanor beamed, certain this approach would work in her favor. The 5 women leaned forward eagerly. "You can whisper it to me if you'd like," Charles said, bending down to his son's level. Henry cupped his small hands around his father's ear and whispered a single word. Charles's expression changed, surprise followed by something softer, more vulnerable than anyone at the table had ever seen on his face. "Are you sure?" he asked his son quietly. Henry nodded emphatically. Charles straightened up and looked around the table. "Well, it seems my son has made his choice." "Wonderful," Eleanor exclaimed. "Which lucky lady has captured our Henry's heart?" Charles's gaze moved past the 5 women to where Belle stood by the serving cart, arranging fresh fruit on a platter. "Henry has chosen Belle." The room fell silent. The 5 women smiled nervously. Assuming it was some kind of joke, Belle nearly dropped the silver tray in her hand, and Eleanor Langford turned a shade of red that clashed violently with her expensive peach suit. "Charles," she hissed, "this is not amusing." But Charles wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at Belle, seeing the shock and confusion on her face. "Henry," he said gently, "why don't you go ask Mrs. Reynolds for some of those special muffins you like? I think we could all use one right now." Henry, sensing the tension but not understanding it, happily ran off to the kitchen. As soon as he was gone, Eleanor exploded. "Have you lost your mind? She's the maid. Charles, the help." The 5 women looked between mother and son, suddenly understanding that this wasn't a joke after all. "I think," Charles said calmly, "that this brunch is over. Ladies, thank you for coming. My driver will take you to the airport." One by one, the women gathered their belongings and left, murmuring awkward goodbyes. Only Catherine paused by Belle on her way out. "He always watched you," she said quietly, "even when he was talking to us. His eyes followed you around the room. I knew then we never stood a chance." When the guests were gone, Eleanor rounded on her son. "You've humiliated me in front of some of the most connected families on the East Coast. And for what? Some inappropriate fantasy about the help." "That's enough, Mother," Charles said, his voice steel. "Belle has been more of a mother to Henry in 3 years than anyone since Julia died, including you." "How dare you?" Eleanor gasped. "I am thinking of Henry's future, the Langford name, your position in society." "I'm thinking of Henry's happiness," Charles countered, "and mine." Throughout this exchange, Belle had remained frozen by the serving cart, unable to process what was happening. Finally, she found her voice. "Mr. Langford." "Charles, I should go," she said, backing toward the door. "This isn't right. Henry doesn't understand what he's asking for." "Don't you dare leave," Eleanor snapped. "Not until you explain what game you're playing. Did you put ideas in that boy's head? Make him believe you could ever be part of this family?" "No," Belle protested. "I would never—" "Mother, stop," Charles interrupted. "Belle has done nothing wrong. If anyone's to blame for this situation, it's me. I've been blind to what's been right in front of me for years." He crossed to where Belle stood, taking the tray from her trembling hands and setting it aside. "Henry sees what I've been too stubborn or scared to admit. You're already part of this family, Belle. You have been for a long time." Eleanor looked between them, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. "This is preposterous. I won't allow it." "It's not your decision to make," Charles said, not taking his eyes off Belle. "It's mine, and Henry's." "Then you leave me no choice," Eleanor said coldly. "I'll be contacting the family lawyers tomorrow. The terms of the will are clear. If you pursue this inappropriate relationship, you risk losing custody of your son." With that final threat, she stormed out, leaving Charles and Belle alone on the terrace. Belle felt like she couldn't breathe. "Charles, your mother is right. You can't risk losing Henry. I'll resign. Today." "No," Charles said firmly, taking her hands in his. "You're not going anywhere. Not unless you want to." "But your mother has been controlling my life since I was Henry's age," Charles finished. "I'm done letting her dictate my choices, especially this one." He looked down at their joined hands, his tanned and manicured, hers slightly rough from work, but gentle. "I don't know what this is between us, Belle, but I'd like the chance to find out, if you're willing." Brielle's heart raced. This couldn't be happening. Men like Charles Langford didn't fall for women like her. That wasn't how the world worked. But looking into his eyes, she saw something she'd never seen there before. Hope. The same hope she saw in Henry's eyes when he looked at her. "What about Henry?" she asked. "He doesn't understand what he's asking for." "I think he understands better than either of us," Charles said with a small smile. "You once told him it's okay to be happy again. Maybe it's time we both took that advice." From the doorway, Henry watched his father holding Brielle's hands, a smile spreading across his small face. For the first time since his mother died, he felt like everything was going to be okay. But what none of them knew was that Eleanor Langford never made empty threats, and she would stop at nothing to prevent what she saw as the ultimate disgrace to the Langford name. The morning after the disastrous brunch, Brielle woke early as usual. Despite the earth-shattering events of the previous day, bed still needed to be made, breakfast still needed to be prepared, and Henry still needed to be ready for school. She moved through her morning routine in a daze, unable to believe what had happened. Charles Langford, her employer, a billionaire, a man from a world entirely different from her own, had held her hands and told her he wanted to see where things might lead between them. It felt like a dream, or maybe a cruel joke. As she prepared Henry's lunch, she heard footsteps behind her. Charles stood in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for the office, but looking like he hadn't slept much. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft in the quiet kitchen. "Good morning, Mr. Lang," she caught herself. "Charles." He smiled, and something in her chest tightened at the sight. "I was hoping we could talk before Henry wakes up." "Of course." She wiped her hands on a towel, suddenly nervous. "About yesterday," Charles began, taking a step closer. "I meant what I said, but I also understand if it's too much, too fast. If you want to pretend it never happened, I'll respect that." Brielle took a deep breath. "Is that what you want?" "No," he said simply. "But I don't want you to feel pressured. Your job isn't at stake here, Brielle, no matter what you decide." "And what about your mother's threats? The custody issue?" Charles's expression hardened slightly. "My lawyers will handle that. She can't actually take Henry away from me. It's just a tactic to control me, one she's used my entire life." Brielle nodded, wanting to believe him but not quite able to. She'd seen enough of Eleanor Langford to know the woman didn't make idle threats. "What do you want, Brielle?" Charles asked, his voice gentle. What did she want? The question was so simple, yet so complicated. She wanted Henry to be happy. She wanted to keep being part of his life. And increasingly, she wanted to be part of Charles's life too, not as his employee but as something more. But wanting didn't make something possible. "I care about Henry more than anything," she finally said. "And I care about you too. But I'm scared, Charles. This isn't how things work in the real world. People like you don't end up with people like me. Maybe it's time to change how things work." He reached for her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she let him take it. "I'm not saying this will be easy, but I think it might be worth trying." Before she could respond, they heard the patter of small feet. Henry appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up in all directions. His eyes widened when he saw his father holding Brielle's hand. "Does this mean Brielle's staying?" he asked, hope brightening his face. Charles looked at Brielle, waiting for her answer. "For now," she said cautiously, not wanting to promise the boy more than she could deliver. But it was enough for Henry. He launched himself at them both, wrapping one arm around his father's legs and the other around Brielle's. "I knew it!" he exclaimed. "I told you she was the right one, Dad." Over Henry's head, Charles and Brielle's eyes met, his filled with a warmth she'd never seen before, hers with cautious hope tinged with fear. For a moment, they stood there like a family, not the kind Eleanor Langford would approve of, but a family nonetheless. The peace didn't last long. By that afternoon, Eleanor's plan was already in motion. Charles was in a board meeting when his assistant rushed in with an urgent message. "Sir, there's something you need to see." She handed him her tablet, open to a local news website. The headline made his blood run cold. "Billionaire's son in inappropriate relationship with live-in maid." Below it was a photo of Brielle holding Henry in the garden, his small arms wrapped around her neck as she spun him in a circle. The photo itself was innocent enough, but the caption twisted it. Sources close to the Langford family expressed concern over unhealthy attachment. Charles stood abruptly, startling the board members. "Meeting adjourned. We'll continue tomorrow." "Charles, we're in the middle of the Ocean Point presentation," one of the older board members protested. "It can wait," Charles snapped, already heading for the door. By the time he reached the estate, reporters had gathered at the gates. Security was keeping them back, but their presence alone was disturbing. How had this happened so quickly? Inside, he found Brielle in Henry's room, helping the boy with his homework. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "You've seen it," he said, not a question. She nodded. "Mrs. Reynolds showed me." "They can't come onto the property," Charles assured her. "Security won't let them through." "It's not me I'm worried about," Brielle said, glancing at Henry, who was watching them with wide, worried eyes. "He shouldn't have to deal with this." Charles knelt beside his son. "Henry, why don't you go down to the kitchen and ask Mrs. Reynolds for a cookie? Brielle and I need to talk." Once Henry was gone, Charles ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "This is my mother's doing. She must have leaked the photo to the press." "It's more than that," Brielle said quietly. She handed him her phone, open to another news site. This one featured quotes from an anonymous family insider, claiming that Brielle had been manipulating Henry, creating an unhealthy dependency to secure her position in the wealthy household. Charles's jaw tightened as he read. "None of this is true." "It doesn't matter," Brielle said. "People will believe it. I'll make a statement, set the record straight." "And say what? That you've fallen for the help?" "That won't make things better, Charles. It will just feed the story." She was right, and they both knew it. Anything he said publicly would only add fuel to the fire. The phone in his pocket buzzed. It was a text from his lawyer. "Need to meet ASAP. Eleanor's filed preliminary custody papers." Charles showed Brielle the message. She sank onto Henry's bed, her shoulders slumping. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she whispered. "She's trying to take Henry away from you because of me." "She won't succeed," Charles insisted, though doubt gnawed at him. His mother had powerful connections in this town. Judges, politicians, influential families who had known the Langfords for generations. "I should leave," Brielle said, her voice breaking, "before this gets worse." "No." Charles sat beside her, taking her hands firmly in his. "That's exactly what she wants. If you leave now, she wins. And if I stay, you could lose your son." Brielle pulled her hands away. "I won't let that happen." Before Charles could argue further, his phone rang. It was the head of the board of Langford Industries. "Charles, we need to discuss this situation immediately," the man said without preamble. "The board is meeting in an hour. Your presence is required." "I'm dealing with a family matter, Gerald." "This is a family matter that's become a company matter," Gerald replied coldly. "Your mother has already spoken to several board members. There are concerns about your judgment." Charles ended the call, fury building inside him. His mother was moving faster than he'd anticipated, attacking from all sides, the media, the custody issue, and now his position at the company. "What is it?" Brielle asked, seeing his expression. "Emergency board meeting. Apparently my mother's been busy." He checked his watch. "I have to go. Will you be all right here with Henry?" "We'll be fine," Brielle assured him, though she looked anything but fine. "Go do what you need to do." Charles hesitated, then leaned forward and gently kissed her forehead. "We'll get through this, Brielle, I promise." The board meeting was exactly as unpleasant as Charles had expected. 8 men and women in expensive suits sat around a polished table, their faces masks of disapproval. His mother sat at the far end, looking triumphant. "Charles," Gerald began, "we've called this meeting to discuss the recent..." Publicity surrounding your household arrangements. My personal life is not board business, Charles said flatly. It becomes board business when it affects stock prices. Another board member, Janet, countered. Our investors are already calling with concerns. Concerns about what exactly? Charles demanded. That I might be dating someone who doesn't belong to a country club? About your judgment, Eleanor cut in smoothly. First with the Ocean Point development, which is months behind schedule and millions over budget. And now this scandal with the Maid. Charles stared at his mother. So that's your angle? Use this situation to question my business decisions too? The board has a responsibility to the shareholders, Gerald said. If your personal judgment is compromised, it raises questions about your professional judgment as well. My personal judgment is fine, Charles said through gritted teeth. And Ocean Point is delayed because we discovered wetlands that needed to be protected, a fact I've explained in multiple reports. Which brings us to our request, Janet said, sliding a document across the table. We're asking for your temporary resignation as CEO until this situation resolves itself. Charles didn't touch the paper. And if I refuse? Then we'll call a shareholder vote, Gerald said. Your mother controls 25% of the shares. Combined with the board's holdings, we have a majority. Charles looked around the table, searching for any sympathetic faces. He found none. This is blackmail, he said quietly. This is business, Eleanor replied. Something you seem to have forgotten. Charles stood, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate calm. I'll have my answer for you tomorrow, but know this, if you force me out, I won't go quietly. Back at the estate, he found Belle in her small room, packing a suitcase. What are you doing? He asked from the doorway. She jumped, not having heard him approach. I'm leaving, Charles, just for a while until things calm down. Running away won't solve anything, he said, entering the room and closing the door behind him. I'm not running away, Belle insisted. I'm trying to protect you and Henry. By leaving him after promising you wouldn't? The words hit their mark. Belle's hands stilled on the clothes she was folding. That's not fair, she whispered. None of this is fair, Charles agreed, his voice softening. But we have to fight it together. If you leave now, my mother wins. Henry loses someone he loves, and He trailed off, emotion making his voice rough. I lose someone I'm just starting to know. Belle looked up at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. I don't know how to fight someone like your mother. I don't have her money or her connections. But you have something she doesn't, Charles said, crossing to her and taking the shirt from her hands. You have Henry's love and mine. Belle froze. Charles, I know it's too soon to say that, he admitted, but it's true all the same. I've spent 4 years hiding from my feelings, burying myself in work, pretending I could be half a father to Henry. Then I look at you, how naturally you love him, how you've brought light back into this house, and I realize what I've been missing. He cupped her face gently in his hands. I'm not letting my mother take that away. Not from Henry, and not from me. For a moment, Belle let herself believe it could be possible, that they could face Eleanor's wealth and power, and win. That she could be more than just the help in this house. Then reality crashed back in. The board wants you to resign, she guessed. Charles nodded. Temporarily, they say. But we both know once I step down, my mother will make sure I don't step back up. And the custody threat? My lawyers are working on it. The will doesn't actually give her as much leverage as she claims, but she can make things difficult, drag Henry through ugly court proceedings. Belle shook her head. I can't let that happen to him, or to you. She pulled away from his touch. I need time to think, Charles. This is all happening so fast. Take all the time you need, he said. Just promise you won't leave without talking to me first. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. I promise. Later that night, after checking that Henry was asleep, Belle slipped out to the garden. The night air was cool against her skin as she walked along the path that led to the small gazebo overlooking the ocean. To her surprise, she found Mrs. Reynolds there, smoking a cigarette. Don't tell Mr. Langford, the cook said with a wink. My one vice. Your secret's safe with me, Belle assured her, sitting on the bench beside the older woman. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Mrs. Reynolds spoke. I've worked for the Langfords for 30 years, you know. Served 3 generations of them. That's a long time, Belle said. Long enough to know that Eleanor Langford is the most stubborn, prideful woman I've ever met. Mrs. Reynolds took a drag of her cigarette. But Charles is his father's son, not hers, and Arthur Langford was a good man who knew his own mind. What happened to him? Belle asked. Charles rarely spoke of his father. Heart attack 10 years ago. Eleanor's been running the show ever since. whether Charles admits it or not. Mrs. Reynolds studied Brielle's face in the moonlight. He looks at you the way Arthur used to look at his wife. Not Eleanor, she was his second wife. His first wife, Charles's mother, was a kindergarten teacher. Brielle's eyes widened. What? Mrs. Reynolds nodded. Eleanor doesn't like people to know that. She came from money, married Arthur after his first wife died, adopted Charles when he was 5, raised him to forget he ever came from simpler stock. Charles never told me. He probably doesn't remember much. He was young when his mother died, and Eleanor made sure the past stayed buried. Mrs. Reynolds stubbed out her cigarette. But that's why she's fighting so hard now. She spent a lifetime erasing Charles's humble beginnings. She won't let him choose a path that reminds the world that the great Langford fortune wasn't always so grand. Brielle absorbed this information, seeing Eleanor's actions in a new light. The woman wasn't just a snob. She was protecting a carefully constructed image that had defined her life. It doesn't change anything, Brielle said finally. She'll still do whatever it takes to get rid of me. Probably, Mrs. Reynolds agreed. Question is, are you going to let her? Before Brielle could answer, they heard urgent footsteps on the garden path. It was Charles, his face tight with worry. Brielle, I've been looking everywhere for you. He nodded to Mrs. Reynolds, who took the hint and discreetly slipped away. My lawyer just called. My mother's moved up the custody hearing. It's scheduled for next week. So soon? Brielle stood, her heart racing. How is that possible? She's pulled strings with the judge, and she's arranged for a child psychologist to evaluate Henry, one who conveniently sits on the board of her charitable foundation. Brielle felt sick. She's rigging the system. Trying to, Charles agreed grimly. But we can fight this, Brielle. My lawyer thinks we have a strong case. Henry is happy and well-adjusted. No judge would take him from his father without clear evidence of harm. But the longer this drags on, the more it hurts Henry, Brielle said. He already knows something's wrong. He asked me today why there were people with cameras at the gates. Charles ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I know, and I hate that he's caught in the middle of this. There's an easy way to end it, Brielle said softly. Let me go, Charles. I can find another job. Henry will adjust eventually. Is that what you want? What I want doesn't matter. It matters to me, Charles interrupted, taking her hands. Do you want to leave, Brielle? Not because of my mother or the media or any of that, but because you don't feel what I feel when we're together? Put that way, the answer was simple. No, she admitted. I don't want to leave. Charles's face softened. Then we fight. Together. The next morning, Charles left early for a meeting with his lawyers. Brielle was helping Henry with his breakfast when the doorbell rang. Assuming it was someone from Charles's legal team, she went to answer it. Instead, she found 2 women from Child Protective Services standing on the doorstep, accompanied by Eleanor Langford, and a man in an expensive suit who could only be her lawyer. Ms. James, one of the CPS workers asked. We need to speak with you regarding Henry Langford. Brielle's stomach dropped. What's this about? We've received a report of possible inappropriate conduct, the woman said, her tone professional but not unkind. May we come in? Eleanor smiled thinly. It's just a routine inquiry, my dear. Nothing to worry about if there's nothing to hide. Brielle stepped back to let them enter, her mind racing. This had to be another of Eleanor's tactics, using her connections to trigger a CPS investigation. But how far would she go? What had she told them? In the formal living room, the CPS workers asked Brielle a series of increasingly uncomfortable questions about her relationship with Henry, how often she was alone with him, whether she helped him bathe or dress, if she ever slept in his room. Only when he has nightmares, Brielle answered truthfully. I stay with him until he falls back asleep. In his bed? The second CPS worker asked, making a note. Sometimes in the chair beside his bed, Brielle clarified. Sometimes I lie on top of the covers next to him if he's very upset. His father is aware of this arrangement. Is he? Eleanor interjected smoothly. My son works very long hours. I wonder how much he really knows about what goes on in his absence. The CPS workers exchanged glances. Ms. James, we'd like to speak with Henry now. Alone. Brielle's heart pounded. He's having breakfast. Can it wait until he's finished? I'm afraid not, the first worker said. Would you show us to him, please? As they walked to the kitchen, Brielle felt Eleanor's triumphant gaze on her back. The woman had orchestrated this perfectly, making an accusation just serious enough to force an investigation, knowing the mere suggestion of impropriety would cast a shadow over Brielle, regardless of the outcome. In the kitchen, Henry looked up from his cereal, his eyes widening at the sight of his grandmother. Grandma, he exclaimed, then noticed the strangers. Who are they? These ladies need to talk to you for a little while, Belle said, keeping her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. I'll be right outside if you need me. No, Ms. James, the second CPS worker said firmly. We need to speak with Henry privately. Perhaps you could wait in another room. Henry's face crumpled in confusion and the beginnings of fear. Belle, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, sweetheart, Belle assured him, though she could feel her world crumbling around her. Just answer their questions honestly, okay? Everything will be fine. As she left the kitchen, Eleanor followed her into the hallway. You should pack your things, she said quietly. Once they file their report, Charles will have no choice but to let you go. If he doesn't, it will only strengthen my case for custody. Belle turned to face the older woman. What exactly did you tell them? Only that I have concerns about the nature of your relationship with my grandson, Eleanor said with mock innocence. Which is true, I do have concerns. You know there's nothing inappropriate happening, Belle said, anger finally breaking through her fear. You're using the system to get your way, regardless of what it does to Henry. I'm protecting my grandson and the Langford name, Eleanor corrected, something my son seems incapable of doing at the moment. By traumatizing a 7-year-old boy, having strangers question him about things he can't possibly understand. Eleanor's smile never wavered. Children are resilient. Henry will adapt to your absence, just as he did to his mother's. The casual cruelty of the statement left Belle speechless. Before she could recover, the front door opened and Charles walked in. He took in the scene instantly. Brielle's pale face, his mother's satisfied smile, the closed kitchen door. What's going on? He demanded. Where's Henry? Child Protective Services is interviewing him, Belle said, her voice shaking slightly. Your mother filed a report. Charles's face went white, then flushed with fury. You did what? What was necessary? Eleanor replied calmly. Someone needed to look out for Henry's best interests. Charles strode to the and threw it over. Henry sat at the tears streaming down his as one of the CPS workers asked him question, a gentle, probing. Daddy! Henry cried, running to. Charles scooped him up, holding him protective. This interview is over, he told the CPS worker. You can speak with my lawyers from now on. Mr. Langford, we're just doing our job, the first worker said. We have to follow up on reports of possible. There is nothing inappropriate happening in my home, Charles interrupted, his voice cold with fury. Except for my mother using the system to wage a personal vendetta. The workers looked uncomfortable. Sir, we understand this is upsetting, but no, you don't understand, Charles said. My son lost his mother 4 years ago. Belle has been the one constant in his life since then. And now you're questioning him about their relationship as if there's something wrong with it. Do you have any idea what that does to a child? Henry clung to his father, burying his face in Charles's neck. They asked if Belle touches me in bad ways, he sobbed. Why would they ask that? Belle would never hurt me. Charles's face hardened even further. He looked at his mother. Get out, now. Charles, be reasonable. Get out, he roared, causing everyone in the room to flinch. You've gone too far this time, Mother. Way too far. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. You're throwing away everything your father and I built for you. And for what? Some maid you barely know? I know her better than I've ever known you, Charles said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. And I know she loves my son more than you ever have. Eleanor drew herself up, her face tight with anger. You'll regret this, Charles. When the board votes tomorrow, when the custody hearing happens next week, you'll regret choosing her over your family. She is family, Charles said simply. The kind that matters. After Eleanor and her lawyer left, Charles turned to the CPS workers. I apologize for losing my temper, but I won't apologize for protecting my son. Whatever report my mother filed is a fabrication, and I'll prove it, but not at Henry's expense. The workers seemed uncertain how to proceed. The accusation had been serious, but the accuser's motives were now clearly suspect. We'll need to complete our investigation, Mr. Langford, the first worker said, but perhaps we can do it in a less confrontational way. My lawyers will be in touch to arrange it, Charles said firmly. For now, I'd appreciate some time alone with my family. After they left, Charles carried Henry to the living room, where Belle waited, her face still pale with shock. I'm so sorry, she said as soon as she saw them. I should have called you right away. I didn't know they were going to question him like that. This isn't your fault, Charles said, sitting on the couch with Henry still in his arms. It's my mother's. And she's gone too far this time. Henry looked up, his tear-stained face serious. Are they going to take me away from you, Dad? Or make Belle leave? No, Charles said firmly. No one is going anywhere, Henry. I promise. But even as he said it, Charles knew the battle was far from over. His mother had escalated things to a point he'd never imagined possible, and tomorrow the board would vote on his future at the company. That night, after Henry was finally asleep, Charles found Belle on the terrace again. She was wrapped in a cardigan against the cool night air, staring out at the dark ocean. "He's asleep," Charles said, coming to stand beside her. "I told him I'd stay until he drifted off." "How is he?" Belle asked. "Confused, scared." Charles sighed heavily. "But resilient, like you said." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling between them. "I keep thinking about what he must have felt," Belle finally said, her voice breaking. "Being asked those questions, not understanding why someone would think I would hurt him." "I know," Charles said, his own voice rough with emotion. "But he'll be okay, Belle. Kids are resilient, like my mother said, but not in the way she meant. They can overcome trauma with the right support. And Henry has us." Belle turned to face him. "What happens tomorrow with the board?" "They'll vote to remove me as CEO, Charles said matter-of-factly. "My mother has made sure of that. And you're okay with that?" Charles considered the question. A week ago, the thought of losing control of Langford Industries would have been unbearable. Now it seemed like a small price to pay. "I started working 80-hour weeks after Julia died," he said. "I told myself it was to secure Henry's future, but really, it was to avoid my grief. To avoid being a father who didn't know how to raise his son alone." He took Brielle's hand, interlacing their fingers. "I've missed so much of his life already. I don't want to miss any more." "But the company is just a company," Charles finished. "My father built it from nothing. Maybe it's time I did something of my own." Brielle squeezed his hand. "What about the custody hearing?" "That's the real fight," Charles admitted. "My mother won't give up easily, but neither will I." The next morning, Charles dressed carefully in his best suit. He wasn't going down without one last stand. "Are you sure about this?" Brielle asked as she straightened his tie, a small, intimate gesture that felt both new and completely natural. "Absolutely," Charles said, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "No more hiding, Brielle. No more pretending." At Langford Industries, the board was already assembled when Charles arrived. His mother sat at the far end of the table, looking confident in her victory. "Charles," Gerald greeted him stiffly, "before we begin the vote, do you have anything you'd like to say?" "I do," Charles said, remaining standing. "I've prepared a statement." He pulled out a folded paper and laid it on the table in front of him. But instead of reading from it, he looked around at the faces of the board members, men and women who had known him for years, some who had known his father. "My father built this company from nothing," he began. "He started with one small property development and grew it into what you see today. He wasn't born wealthy. He didn't come from a prestigious family. He was a self-made man who believed in hard work and treating people with dignity." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his mother stiffen. "What many of you don't know, what my mother has tried very hard to keep secret, is that my birth mother was a kindergarten teacher. My father married her before he had money, before he had connections. He married her because he loved her." A murmur ran through the board. Several members looked at Eleanor, whose face had gone rigid. "When she died, my father was devastated. He buried himself in work, much like I did after Julia's death. And eventually he married my mother, Eleanor, who adopted me and raised me as her own." Charles paused, looking directly at his mother now. "I'm grateful for many things she's taught me, but I won't let her dictate who I can love or who can be part of my family." He turned back to the board. "You've all seen the stories in the press, the photos of my son with Brielle James, who has been his caretaker for 3 years. What those stories don't tell you is that Brielle was there when Henry cried for his mother in the middle of the night. She was there when he was too scared to go back to school after Julia died. She was there when I wasn't, because I was too busy running this company." Charles's voice grew stronger, more confident. "So yes, I've fallen in love with the woman who helped raise my son, who saw him when I couldn't, who loved him when I was too broken to show it. And if that costs me this company, so be it." He picked up the paper from the table. "This is my resignation. Not temporary, but permanent. I'm stepping down as CEO of Langford Industries, effective immediately." The board erupted in surprised murmurs. Eleanor half rose from her seat. "Charles, don't be absurd. You can't just—" "I can, and I am," Charles interrupted. "You wanted me gone, Mother. You got your wish. But if you think this means you've won, that I'll send Brielle away, that I'll go back to the life you've planned for me, you're mistaken." He turned to Gerald. "The vote is unnecessary now, but I do have one request before I go. The Ocean Point development was my project. I'd like to buy it from the company, At fair market value, of course. Gerald looked stunned. That's highly irregular, Charles. The project is already underway. And it's over budget and behind schedule, as my mother pointed out yesterday, Charles countered. Let me take it off your hands. I'll finance it personally. The board members exchanged glances. From a business perspective, the offer made sense. They'd recoup their investment on a troubled project and remove a source of financial risk. We'll need to discuss this in private, Gerald finally said. Charles nodded. Of course, my lawyers will be in touch. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing, the custody hearing next week. I expect the company to remain neutral. This is a family matter, not a corporate one. With that, he walked out, leaving stunned silence behind him. Outside, Charles took a deep breath of fresh air. For the first time in years, he felt truly free. No more living up to his mother's expectations. No more trying to be the perfect CEO, the perfect Langford heir. He was just Charles now, a man who loved his son and was falling in love with a remarkable woman. His phone buzzed with a text from Belle. How did it go? He smiled and typed back, I resigned. Coming home now. Home. The word had a new meaning now. Not the estate with its marble floors and ocean views, but wherever Henry and Belle were. As his car pulled away from Langford Industries, Charles didn't look back. The future, uncertain as it was, beckoned, and for the first time in a very long time he couldn't wait to see what it held. Back at the estate, Belle read Charles's text with a mixture of shock and pride. He'd actually done it, walked away from the company his family had built over generations. For her, for Henry, for the chance at a different kind of life. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Is Dad coming home? Henry asked, looking up from his book. Belle had kept him home from school, not wanting him to face potential reporters or awkward questions from classmates who might have seen the news. Yes, he's on his way, Belle said, trying to keep her voice casual, though her heart was racing. He has some big news to share with us. Good news or bad news? Henry asked, always perceptive. Belle smiled. I think it depends on how you look at it, but I think it's good news. When Charles arrived home, the three of them sat in the sunny breakfast nook while he explained his decision in terms Henry could understand. So you don't have to go to the office anymore? Henry asked, his eyes wide. Not to that office, Charles clarified. I'll still work, but on my own terms, and I'll be home a lot more. With me and Belle. Hope filled the boy's voice. Charles reached across the table to take Brielle's hand. That's the plan. If Belle wants that too. Belle felt tears pricking her eyes. I do, she said softly. But Charles, what about the custody hearing? Your mother won't stop fighting just because you left the company. No, she won't, Charles agreed. In fact, she'll probably fight harder now. But I've been talking with my lawyers. We have a strong case, Belle. The allegations she made to CPS were clearly malicious. The judge will see that. But what if he doesn't? Belle pressed. What if your mother's connections are too strong? Charles's face grew serious. Then we'll appeal. We'll fight as long as it takes. I'm not giving up, Belle. Not on Henry and not on us. Henry looked between them, sensing the gravity of the conversation, even if he didn't fully understand it. Is Grandma still trying to make Belle leave? He asked. Charles hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Henry, she is. But we're not going to let that happen. Henry's small face hardened with determination, looking so much like his father that Brielle's heart ached with love for them both. Good, he said firmly, because Belle promised she wouldn't leave, and Dad says we always keep our promises. Charles smiled at his son. That's right, Henry. We do. Later that afternoon, as the three of them walked along the beach below the estate, Charles's phone rang. It was his lawyer. Charles, we have a problem, the man said without preamble. Your mother has filed for an emergency temporary custody order. The hearing is tomorrow morning. Charles stopped walking, his face going pale. On what grounds? She's claiming that your mental state is unstable due to your sudden resignation from the company, and she submitted the preliminary CPS report, which, while inconclusive, mentions concerns about boundaries between Henry and Miss James. That's ridiculous, Charles said, keeping his voice low so Henry, who was collecting shells a few yards away, wouldn't hear. The full CPS investigation will clear Belle completely. Yes, but that could take weeks, the lawyer explained. In the meantime, the judge might grant temporary custody to your mother as a precautionary measure, especially given her connections. Charles ended the call and turned to Belle, his face grim. My mother's accelerated the custody battle. The hearing is tomorrow. Brielle's hand flew to her mouth. So soon? What does your lawyer think will happen? He's worried, Charles admitted. The judge might grant her temporary custody until the full CPS investigation is complete. Brielle looked at Henry, happily oblivious as he examined a piece of sea glass. The thought of him being taken away, from Charles, from her, from his home, was unbearable. "There has to be something we can do," she said desperately. Charles was quiet for a long moment, watching his son. Then he turned to Brielle, a new resolve in his eyes. "There is," he said, "but it would mean a big change, Brielle, for all of us." "What kind of change?" Charles took her hands in his. "My mother's entire case rests on portraying our relationship as inappropriate, you as the help, overstepping boundaries. But what if you weren't the help anymore? What if you were my wife?" Brielle stared at him in shock. "Charles, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you," he said simply. "I think I have for a long time, but I was too blind to see it. And I'm saying that if we were married, my mother's case would fall apart. No judge would grant her custody over a child's father and stepmother without extreme circumstances." "You're talking about getting married to win a custody battle," Brielle said slowly. That's not how it's supposed to be." "No, it's not," Charles agreed. "In a perfect world, I'd court you properly. We'd date, take our time, let Henry adjust to the idea gradually. But this isn't a perfect world, Brielle. It's one where my mother is trying to take my son away because I've fallen in love with someone she deems unworthy." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not proposing just to win a legal battle. I'm proposing because I love you, because Henry loves you, because I can't imagine my life, our life, without you in it." Brielle felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "Charles, this is crazy. We've barely even kissed." A smile tugged at his lips. "That's easily remedied." He leaned down and gently pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, questioning at first, then deepening as Brielle responded. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. Are you kissing?" Henry's voice broke the moment. He stood a few feet away, his nose wrinkled in childish disgust, though his eyes sparkled with delight. Charles laughed, keeping one arm around Brielle's waist. "Yes, Henry, I was kissing Brielle. Is that okay with you?" Henry considered this seriously, then nodded. "I guess, if it means she stays forever." "That's what I'm hoping too," Charles said, looking back at Brielle. "What do you say? Will you marry me, Brielle James? Not just for the custody battle, but for us, for our family." Brielle looked from Charles to Henry, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life unfolding, falling in love with her employer, becoming a mother to his son, facing down his formidable mother. But looking into Charles's eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. With him, with Henry, creating the family they all deserved. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Henry whooped with joy and threw himself at them both, and for a moment, they stood there on the beach, arms wrapped around each other, the sound of the waves a backdrop to their laughter and tears. None of them noticed the figure watching from the cliff above. Eleanor Langford stood at the edge of the estate's property, her face a mask of fury as she witnessed the scene below. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, Charles, Brielle, and their lawyers arrived at the courthouse for the emergency custody hearing. They'd worked through the night, making arrangements that had seemed impossible just hours before. "Remember," Charles's lawyer said as they prepared to enter the courtroom, "the marriage license has been filed, but it's not official yet. The judge may still grant temporary custody to your mother while the CPS investigation is ongoing." "He won't," Charles said with quiet confidence, "not after he hears what I have to say." Inside, Eleanor sat with her team of attorneys, looking impeccable in a conservative blue suit. She barely glanced at Charles and Brielle as they entered. The judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s, called the court to order. "This is an emergency hearing regarding the temporary custody of Henry Langford. I understand there are serious allegations being made about the child's home environment." Eleanor's lead attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We have grave concerns about the child's well-being. Mr. Langford has recently displayed erratic behavior, including resigning suddenly from his position as CEO of a major corporation. Additionally, there is an ongoing CPS investigation regarding inappropriate boundaries between the child and Ms. James, a household employee." The judge turned to Charles's lawyer. "And your response to these allegations?" Charles stood before his lawyer could speak. "Your Honor, may I address the court directly?" After a moment's consideration, the judge nodded. "You may, Mr. Langford." Charles approached the bench. "Your Honor, my mother has painted a picture of instability and impropriety in my home. She claims I'm having some sort of breakdown because I chose to step down from my company. She insinuates that my son's relationship with Belle James is somehow inappropriate. He paused, his voice growing stronger. The truth is much simpler. I resigned from Langford Industries because I want to be a more present father to my son. And yes, I have developed feelings for Belle, who has helped raise Henry for the past 3 years. Feelings that are entirely mutual and appropriate. Eleanor scoffed audibly, earning a sharp look from the judge. In fact, Charles continued, Belle and I were married this morning in a private ceremony. A gasp went through the courtroom. Eleanor half rose from her seat before her lawyer pulled her back down. This is absurd, she exclaimed. He's obviously trying to circumvent the court's authority. The judge banged his gavel. Mrs. Langford, control yourself or you'll be removed from my courtroom. Charles produced a document and handed it to the bailiff. Our marriage certificate, Your Honor. Belle is now legally Henry's stepmother. The judge examined the document carefully. This appears to be in order, Mr. Langford, but I must say, the timing is suspicious. I understand how it looks, Your Honor, Charles acknowledged, but my feelings for Belle aren't new, nor are hers for me. What is new is my mother's attempts to separate us, to take my son away because she disapproves of the woman I love. He turned to look at Eleanor directly. A woman who ironically reminds me very much of my birth mother, a kindergarten teacher who married my father before he had wealth or status, a fact my mother has tried very hard to erase from our family history. Eleanor's face went white with fury. How dare you, she hissed. The judge banged his gavel again. Mrs. Langford, one more outburst, and you will be held in contempt. Charles turned back to the judge. Your Honor, my mother's petition isn't about Henry's welfare. It's about control. Control she's exercised over our family for decades. I'm simply asking for the chance to raise my son with the woman I love, without my mother's interference. The judge considered this, then addressed Eleanor's lawyer. Counselor, your client's petition rests largely on the ongoing CPS investigation. Do you have the full report? No, Your Honor, the lawyer admitted. Only the preliminary findings, which note some concerns about boundaries. I have the complete report, Charles's lawyer interjected, approaching the bench with a document. It was completed this morning and expedited due to the emergency nature of this hearing. The judge read through the report carefully, his expression giving nothing away. Finally, he looked up. The CPS report indicates no evidence of abuse or inappropriate behavior, he said. It does note an unusually close bond between the child and Ms. James, now Mrs. Langford, but characterizes this as positive and nurturing. He turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Langford, your petition for emergency temporary custody is denied. Furthermore, I find your allegations to be without merit and potentially malicious in nature. Eleanor's face flushed with anger. This isn't over, Charles, she said, rising from her seat. You've made a mockery of our family name. Your father would be ashamed. No, Mother, Charles replied calmly. My father would have understood. After all, he made the same choice once. As Eleanor stormed out of the courtroom, Charles turned to Belle, taking her hands in his. It's over, he said softly. We won. But even as he said it, a small doubt lingered. His mother was not one to accept defeat gracefully, and somewhere in the back of his mind a warning bell sounded. This victory felt almost too easy. On the drive home, Charles called to check on Henry, who was with Mrs. Reynolds at the estate. The boy was eager to hear how the grown-up meeting had gone. Everything's fine, Henry, Charles assured him. Belle and I are coming home now, and we have some exciting news for you. That you got married, Henry asked matter-of-factly. Mrs. Reynolds told me this morning. Charles laughed. Well, that was supposed to be a surprise, but yes, Belle is officially your stepmother now. How do you feel about that? Good, Henry said simply. Can we have cake to celebrate? Absolutely, Charles promised. The biggest cake you can imagine. As he ended the call, Charles glanced at Belle, who was looking out the window with a pensive expression. Are you okay? He asked, taking her hand. Just processing everything, she admitted. Yesterday I was your maid. Today I'm your wife. It's a lot to take in. Do you regret it? Charles asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. Belle squeezed his hand. Not for a second. I hope someday people will believe we married for love, not for legal strategy. We did marry for love, Charles said firmly. The timing was rushed, but the feelings are real, Belle. At least for me. For me too, she assured him. It's just going to take some getting used to. Being Mrs. Langford instead of the help. Charles lifted her hand to his lips. You were never just the help to me or to Henry, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be in our lives. As they pulled through the gates of the estate, They were relieved to see that the reporters who had been camped outside were gone. Perhaps the news of their marriage had already spread, making the story less scandalous than Eleanor had hoped. In the driveway, Henry was waiting, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Mrs. Reynolds stood behind him, smiling warmly. "Congratulations, you two," she said as they got out of the car. "About time, if you ask me." Henry ran to them, throwing his arms around them both. "Does this mean we're a real family now?" he asked, looking up with hope in his eyes. "We always were," Belle said, kneeling to his level. "The papers just make it official." That evening, after a celebration dinner and the promised cake, the three of them sat in the living room talking about the future. Henry had 1,000 questions about what would change now that Belle was officially his stepmother. "Do I call you Mom now?" he asked her. Belle exchanged a glance with Charles. "You can call me whatever makes you comfortable, Henry. Belle is still fine if that's what you want." Henry thought about this seriously. "Maybe I'll try Mom sometimes, when it feels right." The simple statement brought tears to Brielle's eyes. "I'd like that," she said softly. "But I want you to know, I'm not trying to replace your real Mom. She'll always be in your heart." "I know," Henry said with the straightforward acceptance of a child. "Dad says people can have lots of different kinds of love in their hearts. It doesn't run out." Charles smiled at his son's wisdom. "That's exactly right, Henry." As the evening wound down and Henry went upstairs to get ready for bed, Charles pulled Brielle close on the couch. "Happy?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Very," she said, leaning into his touch. "Though I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Your mother didn't seem like someone who gives up easily." Charles sighed. "She isn't, but she's also practical. The custody battle was her strongest play, and she lost. The board already voted me out of the company, so that leverage is gone. I'm not sure what else she could do." "I hope you're right," Brielle said, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor Langford wasn't done with them yet. Later, after they'd tucked Henry in together, a simple routine that now felt different, more permanent, Charles led Brielle to the master bedroom. She hesitated at the threshold. "I can sleep in my old room," she offered, "until we've had time to adjust to everything." Charles looked at her with such tenderness that her heart skipped. "We've been adjusting for 3 years, Brielle, but if you're not ready, I understand." Brielle thought about it, then smiled and took his hand. "I'm ready," she said. "I think I have been for a long time." As they fell asleep in each other's arms that night, Brielle felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. 1 year later, the estate looked different. Charles had redesigned parts of it, making it less formal, more welcoming. The Ocean Point development was thriving under his sole direction, transformed from luxury condos to a mixed-income community with parks and schools. Brielle had started a small foundation to help single parents, using her experience and the resources now available to her to make a difference in others' lives. Henry was thriving too, more outgoing, more confident, secure in the love that surrounded him. For their first anniversary, Charles planned a small celebration in the garden where they'd first admitted their feelings for each other. Just the three of them, plus Mrs. Reynolds and a few close friends they'd made over the past year. As they raised glasses to toast the occasion, a car pulled up the driveway. A woman stepped out, young, perhaps in her early 30s, with a gentle smile that seemed somehow familiar. She approached the gathering hesitantly. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "I'm looking for Brielle Langford." Brielle stepped forward. "That's me." The woman smiled. "You probably don't remember me. I was at the engagement brunch a year ago, one of the candidates." She laughed softly. "I'm Catherine Morgan, but that's not why I'm here." Charles moved to stand beside his wife. "What can we do for you, Catherine?" "Actually," Catherine said, her expression growing serious, "I'm here because I was Julia's sister." Brielle froze. Charles's face went pale. "Julia never had a sister," he said slowly. "She was an only child." Catherine shook her head. "Half-sister. We had the same father. She found me about a year before she died, but asked me to keep our relationship secret until she could figure out how to tell you." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "After she passed, I respected her wishes to stay away, but recently I found this among her things. It was addressed to Henry, to be given to him when he was older. But there's something else in it. Something about the Langford family that wasn't in the will. Something that may change everything." Brielle took the envelope with trembling hands, looking at Charles questioningly. "Open it," he said, his voice barely audible. As Brielle broke the seal, she had no idea that the contents would indeed change everything, not just for them, but for the entire Langford legacy. And somewhere across town, in her penthouse apartment, Eleanor Langford smiled as she hung up the phone. Her sources had confirmed that Catherine Morgan had made contact. The final phase of her plan was now in motion. Brielle's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter addressed to Henry in flowing handwriting, along with a small USB drive and several folded documents. "Should we read this privately?" she asked Charles, glancing at their anniversary guests who were watching with undisguised curiosity. Charles nodded. "Let's go inside." He turned to their friends. "Please, enjoy the food and music. We'll be back shortly." As they walked toward the house, Henry ran up to them. "What's happening? Who's that lady?" Charles placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "This is Catherine. She knew your mother." Henry's eyes widened. "My real mother, Julia." Catherine knelt down to his level. "Yes, Henry, your mother was my sister. I've been wanting to meet you for a long time." Henry studied her face carefully. "You have the same eyes as in her pictures." Catherine smiled, tears shimmering. "People always said we had the same eyes." "Henry," Brielle said softly, "we need to read something important. Why don't you stay with Mrs. Reynolds for a little while?" "But it's about my mom, isn't it?" Henry protested. "I want to know too." Charles and Brielle exchanged glances. Henry was 8 now, more mature than most children his age, and this concerned him as much as anyone. "All right," Charles decided, "but if it gets too complicated or upsetting, you'll go with Mrs. Reynolds. Deal?" Henry nodded solemnly. "Deal." In Charles's study, the 4 of them gathered around his desk. Brielle carefully unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. "My dearest Henry, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you, and you're old enough to understand some difficult truths. First, know that I loved you with my whole heart from the moment I knew you were growing inside me. Nothing in this letter changes that. What you don't know, what Charles doesn't know, is that before I died, I discovered something troubling about the Langford family business. Eleanor and Arthur were involved in deals that weren't just unethical, but potentially illegal. Land acquisitions where people were forced out of their homes, environmental regulations that were bypassed with bribes, workers who were exposed to dangerous conditions. I confronted Eleanor about what I'd found. She threatened me, Henry. She said if I went public, she would make sure Charles lost everything, the company, his reputation, and worst of all, you. She had documents that could be manipulated to make it look like Charles was involved, even though he knew nothing about these dealings. I was going to tell Charles everything, to fight alongside him, but then I got sick, so very sick, so quickly, too quickly. I've never been able to prove it, but I've always wondered if my illness was entirely natural. The doctors couldn't explain why it progressed so rapidly. On the USB drive, you'll find all the evidence I gathered. And Catherine, my sister, who I found just before my diagnosis, has been keeping additional documents safe. I'm so sorry to burden you with this, my darling boy, but the truth needs to come out, for your sake, and for all the people who were harmed. With eternal love, your mother. Silence fell over the room as Brielle finished reading. Charles sat frozen, his face ashen. "This can't be true," he finally whispered. "My mother is manipulative, controlling, even cruel at times. But this is suggesting something far worse." Catherine spoke up. "Julia was terrified in those final months, not just of dying, but of what might happen to Henry if the truth came out while he was still young. She made me promise to wait, to watch from a distance, to make sure he was safe." "Why come forward now?" Brielle asked. "Because of Eleanor," Catherine explained. "She found me 3 months ago. Somehow she discovered Julia had a sister and tracked me down. She offered me money, a lot of money, to come here today with a different story. A lie about Julia that would drive a wedge between you all." Charles's head snapped up. "What kind of lie?" "That Julia had confessed to me that Henry wasn't your biological son," Catherine said quietly. "That she'd had an affair. Eleanor wanted me to present fake DNA test results and everything." Henry's eyes filled with tears. "Grandma wanted to say I'm not Dad's real son." Charles pulled Henry close. "It wouldn't have mattered even if it were true, which it's not. You're my son in every way that counts." Brielle connected the dots. This was her backup plan all along. When the custody battle failed, when she couldn't break us apart through the media or the board, she was going to try to break your bond with Henry. "But why would Catherine tell us this instead of going along with Eleanor's plan?" Charles asked, eyeing the woman warily. "Because Julia would have hated it," Catherine said simply. "And because what Eleanor did to her, what she might have done, is unforgivable." Charles picked up the USB drive, turning it over in his hands. "We need to see what's on here." He plugged it into his computer, the screen filled with folders containing financial records, emails, photographs of documents. As they scrolled through, a pattern emerged, evidence of the unethical practices Julia had described in her letter, spanning decades. "And my father's name is on some of these," Charles noted, his voice hollow with disbelief. He knew. Julia believed he was pressured by Eleanor, Catherine explained, that she was the mastermind, using his business expertise, but pushing the boundaries further than he would have gone alone. Charles continued scrolling until he reached a folder labeled Liberty Heights. Inside were photos of a small neighborhood being demolished, families standing with their belongings on the street. The final image was of Eleanor shaking hands with a city official, both smiling as bulldozers worked in the background. "I remember this," Charles said slowly. "It was 15 years ago, a revitalization project that turned a working-class neighborhood into luxury condos, but Mother told me all the residents had been fairly compensated, given new homes." "They weren't," Catherine said. "Julia found some of them living in shelters months later. The compensation money never materialized." "And there's more," Belle added, pointing to another folder labeled Oceanside Health Study. Inside were medical reports documenting elevated cancer rates in a community near one of Langford Industries' chemical plants. "The report was buried," Catherine explained. "The plant kept operating without additional safety measures for years." Henry had been listening quietly, his young face serious as he tried to understand. "Did Grandma make people sick? Like my mum?" The innocent question hung in the air. Charles looked at his son, unsure how to answer. "We don't know for sure what happened to your mom, Henry," he said carefully, "but these documents show that Grandma has done some very wrong things." Belle squeezed Charles's hand. "What do we do now?" Charles stood, a new resolve hardening his features. "First, we verify everything. I want independent experts to examine these documents, confirm their authenticity. Then, if it's all true," he paused, the weight of what he was considering evident in his expression. "Then we go public, all of it." "Eleanor will fight back," Catherine warned. "She'll try to pin everything on your father, claim she was just following his lead." "Let her try," Charles said grimly. "I won't let her poison another generation of this family." Later that night, after Henry was asleep and Catherine had left with promises to stay in touch, Charles and Belle sat on the terrace where they'd spent so many important moments. "I still can't believe it," Charles said, staring out at the dark ocean. "All these years I thought I knew who my parents were, what our company stood for." "People can hide their true selves for a lifetime," Belle said softly, "especially from those closest to them." Charles turned to her, taking her hands. "Thank you for being here, for facing this with me. I don't know what I would do without you." "You'd find your way," Belle assured him. "You're stronger than you think." "Maybe," Charles acknowledged, "but I'm better with you beside me." He pulled her close, drawing strength from her steady presence. The next morning, Charles called his most trusted former colleagues from Langford Industries, ones who had left or been pushed out when Eleanor gained more control. Together with legal experts and forensic accountants, they began the painstaking process of verifying Julia's evidence. Days turned into weeks. Henry bonded with his Aunt Catherine, who shared stories and photos of Julia that neither Charles nor Henry had seen before. Belle watched their growing relationship with a mixture of joy and trepidation. Joy that Henry was connecting with his birth mother's family, trepidation about what would happen when the truth about Eleanor finally came to light. 1 month after Catherine's arrival, Charles received the confirmation he'd been waiting for. The documents were authentic. The evidence was damning. Eleanor Langford had been the architect of decades of corporate malfeasance, environmental negligence, and possibly worse. "We need to take this to the authorities," his lead investigator advised. "Some of these actions fall within the statute of limitations for criminal charges." Charles nodded, his face grim but determined. "Set up the meetings. But first I need to confront her myself." Brielle's eyes widened. "Is that wise after everything she's tried to do to us?" "Probably not," Charles admitted. "But I need to see her face when I tell her I know. I need to ask her about Julia's illness myself." "I'm coming with you," Belle said firmly. Charles started to protest, then stopped. This was his wife, his partner in every sense. She had as much right to confront Eleanor as he did. "All right," he agreed. "We'll go together." Eleanor Langford's penthouse apartment was the epitome of old money luxury. Antique furniture, priceless art, views of the city skyline. She greeted them with cold surprise. Charles and the maid. She hadn't once used Brielle's name since their marriage. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "We need to talk, Mother," Charles said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "About Julia, about Liberty Heights." about Oceanside. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, a momentary lapse in her perfect composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, turning to pour herself a drink. "I think you do," Charles pressed. "We have the documents, Mother, all of them. The bribes, the falsified environmental reports, the residents who were cheated out of their homes. Julia found them before she died." At the mention of Julia's name, Eleanor's hand tightened on her glass. "Your wife was always poking into matters that didn't concern her." "They concerned her because they concerned me," Charles countered. "She was trying to protect me, to protect our family's legacy from what you had turned it into." Eleanor scoffed. "I built that legacy. Your father may have started the company, but I made it what it was. The hard decisions, the necessary compromises, those were mine." "Compromises?" Brielle spoke up, unable to contain her disgust. "People lost their homes. Some got sick, some may have died." Eleanor turned her cold gaze on Brielle. "Stay out of this. You're not a Langford, no matter what piece of paper says you are." "She's more of a Langford than you ever were," Charles shot back. "She understands what family really means. Loyalty, love, putting others first. Not power, not appearances, not control." Eleanor set down her glass, her composure finally cracking. "You ungrateful boy. Everything I did for you. For this family. The world doesn't reward weakness or hesitation. I made sure the Langford name meant something. Fear and corruption?" Charles shook his head. "That's not the legacy I want for Henry." "Henry?" Eleanor repeated, a strange smile crossing her face. "My grandson. Did your new friend Catherine tell you everything about him, I wonder?" Charles frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Julia's medical records," Eleanor said smoothly. "Did Catherine share those? The treatments she was undergoing before she got pregnant?" "Stop it, Mother," Charles warned. "Whatever you're implying—" "I'm not implying anything," Eleanor interrupted, "just suggesting that perhaps Catherine hasn't been entirely forthcoming. Perhaps there's more to Henry's story than you know." Brielle stepped forward, her patience gone. "Enough! We didn't come here for your mind games. We came to tell you that we're taking everything to the authorities. The evidence, the witness statements, all of it." Eleanor's smile vanished. "You wouldn't dare. It would destroy the company. Thousands of jobs lost. The Langford name ruined forever." "The company is already changing," Charles said. "I've been buying back shares quietly for months. Soon I'll have controlling interest again. And my first act will be to make restitution to everyone harmed by your actions." "You'll bankrupt yourself," Eleanor warned. "Maybe," Charles acknowledged. "But Henry will grow up knowing his father stood for something right, even when it was hard." Eleanor's face hardened. "And what about Julia? Are you prepared for the world to know what she was planning? The affair, the child that might not be yours?" "There was no affair," Charles said confidently. "Catherine already told us about your scheme to plant that story." "It won't work, Mother." For the first time, Eleanor looked uncertain. "She told you? That wasn't part of our arrangement?" "No, it wasn't," Charles agreed, "because Catherine chose truth over your money, something you've never understood." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Julia's illness. It progressed unusually quickly, the doctors said. Too quickly to be natural. Did you have anything to do with that?" Eleanor's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine shock. "You think I would—" She stopped, took a breath. "I may be many things, Charles, but I would never harm the mother of my grandchild. Whatever you believe about me, don't believe that." Something in her voice, a rare note of sincerity, made Charles hesitate, but the evidence of her other misdeeds was too overwhelming to ignore. "Goodbye, Mother," he said quietly. "The authorities will be contacting you soon." As they rode the elevator down, Brielle took Charles's hand. "Are you okay?" "No," he admitted, "but I will be. We all will be." The next morning, Charles made good on his promise. He contacted the district attorney's office and turned over all the evidence. By afternoon, the story had broken in the media. Langford Industries scandal. Decades of corruption exposed. Charles watched the coverage with a strange sense of detachment. It felt like watching the dismantling of someone else's life, not his own. Beside him, Brielle kept one arm around Henry, who was struggling to understand why his father's picture was on television. "Are you in trouble, Dad?" he asked worriedly. "No, Henry," Charles assured him. "I'm helping fix something that went wrong a long time ago. Sometimes doing the right thing causes problems at first, but it's still the right thing to do." The phone rang constantly. Reporters seeking comment, former business associates expressing shock or outrage, lawyers offering their services. Charles ignored them all, focusing instead on preparing his own statement. "Are you sure about this?" Brielle asked, as he reviewed his notes one last time. "Once you speak publicly, there's no going back." "I'm sure," Charles said firmly. "The Langford name needs to stand for something good again. This is how it starts." The press conference was set for noon in front of the Langford Industries headquarters. When Charles and Brielle arrived, the crowd of reporters was even larger than they'd expected. Cameras flashed as they made their way to the podium. Charles straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and began. "My name is Charles Langford. Many of you know me as the former CEO of Langford Industries, a company founded by my father and built into what it is today through the efforts of many people, including my mother, Eleanor Langford." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled reporters. "What most of you don't know is that the success of Langford Industries came at a terrible price. A price paid not by my family, but by ordinary people whose lives were disrupted, whose health was compromised, whose rights were violated in the pursuit of profit and power." Murmurs ran through the crowd as Charles continued, outlining the evidence they'd discovered and his mother's role in the company's darkest dealings. "I was blind to these activities for years," he admitted, "focused on my own grief after my wife's death, buried in work, absent from my son's life in ways I deeply regret. But someone else wasn't blind. My late wife Julia discovered the truth before she died. She gathered evidence intending to expose these wrongs but fell ill before she could act." Charles's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "For 4 years after Julia's death, I continued to fail as a father. My son was raised primarily by Brielle James, who worked in our home as a maid, but became so much more, a caretaker, a friend, a mother figure to a boy who desperately needed one." He reached for Brielle's hand, drawing her closer to the microphone. "When my son told me he wanted Brielle to be his new mother, I finally opened my eyes, not just to her, but to everything I'd been ignoring. I saw a woman of extraordinary compassion and strength. I saw my mother's attempts to control my life and my son's future, and eventually I saw the truth about how our family's wealth was built." Brielle squeezed his hand, offering silent support as he continued. "My mother tried everything to separate us. Legal threats, media smears, even attempting to bribe someone to lie about my son's parentage. She did this not out of concern for Henry, but to maintain control over the Langford name and fortune, a name and fortune built partially through exploitation and corruption." The crowd had fallen completely silent, hanging on his every word. "I stand before you today not as a Langford heir, but as a father and husband who wants to build a better legacy for his family. I've submitted all evidence of wrongdoing to the proper authorities. I'm personally committing to making restitution to those harmed by my family's company, and I'm asking for forgiveness, not for myself, but for the chance to show that people can change, that families can heal, that wrongs can be made right." His voice broke slightly on the last words. Brielle stepped closer to the microphone. "My husband has shown more courage today than most people show in a lifetime," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not everyone would be willing to expose their own family's wrongdoing, to risk their reputation and fortune for the truth, but that's the man I married. That's the father Henry deserves." As she spoke, a commotion arose at the back of the crowd. Eleanor Langford pushed her way through, her face flushed with fury. "Lies!" she shouted. "All of it lies. This woman has poisoned my son against me, against his own family." Security moved to intercept her, but Charles waved them off. "Let her speak," he said quietly. Eleanor reached the front of the crowd, pointing an accusing finger at Brielle. "She came into our home as a servant and manipulated her way into my son's bed and my grandson's affections. And now she's convinced Charles to destroy everything we've built." Charles stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "That's enough, Mother. Brielle didn't convince me of anything. The evidence speaks for itself. Evidence planted by your precious Julia," Eleanor spat. "She never understood what it takes to build something lasting in this world." "No, she understood perfectly," Charles countered. "She understood that nothing built on suffering and dishonesty can truly last. She was trying to save this family, not destroy it." Eleanor's gaze swept over the assembled reporters, suddenly aware of how this confrontation would appear in tomorrow's headlines. She straightened, struggling to regain her composure. "You'll regret this, Charles," she said, her voice low, but carrying in the tense silence. "When the lawsuits start, when the shareholders lose everything, when your son grows up with the burden of your betrayal, you'll regret choosing her over your own blood." "She is family," Charles replied, echoing the words he'd said to her a year ago. "The kind that matters, And Henry will grow up knowing his father chose truth and justice over wealth and power. That's a legacy to be proud of. Eleanor's face twisted with rage and something else, perhaps a flicker of grudging respect for the son who had finally stood up to her. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her proud bearing undiminished despite her public humiliation. As the press conference ended and they made their way back to their car, a reporter called out one final question. "Mr. Langford, what happens now? To you, to your family?" Charles paused, looking at Belle. In her eyes, he found the same strength and love that had sustained him through the past year of turmoil. "Now," he said, "we rebuild. Not an empire or a fortune, but a family, a real one." The months that followed were challenging but transformative. As predicted, lawsuits were filed, investigations launched, the Langford fortune significantly diminished by settlements and restitution payments. Eleanor faced criminal charges for the most egregious violations, though her high-priced legal team managed to keep her out of prison. Charles refocused his energy on Ocean Point, transforming it from a luxury development into a mixed-income community with affordable housing, green spaces, and a community center named after Julia. Belle used her foundation to support families displaced by previous Langford projects, offering education grants and housing assistance. Henry thrived with the stability of their family unit, his nightmares fading as he grew more secure in the love surrounding him. He developed a close relationship with his Aunt Catherine, who became a regular visitor to their home, bringing stories and mementos of Julia that helped keep her memory alive. 1 year after the press conference, they held a small gathering to celebrate the opening of the Julia Langford Community Center at Ocean Point. Friends, colleagues, and many of the families who had received restitution from the Langford settlements attended. As Charles finished his dedication speech, he spotted a familiar figure at the back of the crowd, his mother, looking older and more subdued than he'd ever seen her. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away. "Was that?" Belle asked, following his gaze. "Yes," Charles said quietly. "I invited her. Didn't think she'd come. People can surprise you," Belle observed, "even after a lifetime of knowing them." That evening, as they sat on their terrace watching the sunset, Henry playing nearby with a model airplane, Charles reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. From a grief-stricken widower buried in work to a man who had found love again and the courage to stand for what was right. From a distant father to one who treasured every moment with his son. "What are you thinking about?" Belle asked, resting her head on his shoulder. "About how lucky I am," Charles replied. "Despite everything, the scandal, the financial losses, the public scrutiny, I've never been happier." Belle smiled. "Henry said something similar yesterday. He told me he was glad things happened the way they did, even the hard parts, because now we're a real family." "Smart kid," Charles said, watching his son with pride. "Gets that from his mother." "Which one?" Belle teased. "Both," Charles said, kissing her gently. "Definitely both." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine, who hurried up the terrace steps with an odd expression on her face. "Sorry I missed the ceremony," she said, slightly out of breath. "I was at the hospital going through more of Julia's medical records." Charles frowned. "I thought we had all of those already." "So did I," Catherine said, sitting down across from them. "But there was a separate file, sealed by her oncologist. I finally got access to it today." Something in her tone made Belle sit up straighter. "What did you find?" Catherine hesitated, glancing at Henry, who was still playing nearby. "Maybe we should discuss this later," she suggested. "No," Charles said firmly. "No more secrets in this family. Whatever it is, we face it together." Catherine nodded, taking a deep breath. "Julia underwent fertility treatments before she got pregnant with Henry. Very experimental treatments at the time." "I knew that," Charles said with a hint of confusion. "We'd been trying for a baby for years." "Yes, but what you don't know, what the sealed records show, is that there was a mistake at the fertility clinic, a mix-up with donor materials." Charles froze. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Henry's biological father—" Catherine paused, her voice dropping. "It wasn't you, Charles. It was someone else entirely." Belle gasped softly. But that's what Eleanor wanted Catherine to lie about. She was going to plant a fake story about Julia having an affair. "The irony is," Catherine continued, "Eleanor might have known the truth all along. There are notes in the file about her meeting with Julia's doctor, several times after Julia's diagnosis. She could have been planning to use this information against you someday when it suited her purposes." Charles looked over at Henry, peacefully playing in the fading sunlight, completely unaware of the bombshell that had just dropped. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, his voice steady and sure. "Henry is my son in every way that counts. DNA doesn't make a family. Love does." Belle reached for his hand, her eyes filling with tears at the simplicity and strength of his response. "There's more," Catherine said hesitantly. "The fertility clinic records show the identity of the biological father. He's still alive, Charles, and he has rights, legally speaking." "Who is he?" Charles asked, his heart pounding despite his brave words. Catherine handed him a folder. "His name is David Mitchell. He was a medical student at the time, donating to pay his tuition. Now he's a pediatric surgeon in Boston." Charles stared at the photo clipped to the file, a young man with Henry's same thoughtful eyes and serious expression. The resemblance was striking, now that he was looking for it. "Does he know?" Belle asked. "Not yet," Catherine replied. "The clinic contacted him about the mix-up, but they can't reveal Henry's identity without your permission. He's requested contact if the family is willing." Charles closed the file, his mind racing. After everything they'd been through, the custody battles, the scandal, rebuilding their lives, now this new challenge. "We need time to think," he said finally, "to decide what's best for Henry." "Of course," Catherine agreed, standing to leave. "Take all the time you need." "But Charles," she paused at the top of the steps. Julia would have wanted Henry to know the truth when he was ready. She believed that secrets only hurt the people we're trying to protect. After she left, Charles and Belle sat in silence watching Henry play as the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon. The boy who had brought them together, who had seen what they couldn't see themselves, whose simple wish for a mother had changed all their lives. "What do we do?" Belle finally asked. Charles took her hand, drawing strength from her presence, just as he had through every challenge they'd faced together. "We do what we've always done," he said. "We put Henry first. We face this together as a family. And we trust that love, real love, is stronger than biology, stronger than scandal, stronger than anything life throws at us." Belle rested her head on his shoulder, watching the boy who had captured her heart from the first moment she'd met him. "He's going to be okay," she said softly. "We all are." "I know," Charles agreed, his arm tightening around her, "because we have what matters most." As darkness fell and the stars appeared overhead, Henry ran back to them, nestling between them on the bench. "Can we have hot chocolate?" he asked. "And can you tell me the story about how you fell in love?" Belle laughed, ruffling his hair. "Again, you've heard it 100 times. I like that story," Henry insisted. "It's my favorite." Charles smiled, meeting Brielle's eyes over their son's head. "Mine too," he said softly. "Mine too." Whatever challenges lay ahead, telling Henry the truth about his biology, deciding whether to contact his biological father, continuing to rebuild their lives after the scandal, they would face them together, bound by something stronger than blood or wealth or social status, bound by a mother's touch, the gentle hands that had rocked a lonely boy to sleep, that had brought a grieving man back to life, that had created a family where once there had been only empty spaces and silent rooms. As they walked inside, arms around each other, the ocean waves crashed against the shore below, constant, powerful, enduring, just like love.